Jack Thompson had always believed that trust was the foundation of any strong relationship. For 15 years, he had built a life with Emily, a woman he adored and trusted without hesitation. Together, they had weathered storms and celebrated victories, weaving a bond that seemed unshakable. Their home was a picture of stability, warm, welcoming, and full of shared memories. Jack took pride in their marriage and in the role he played as a mentor to his nephew, Ryan. After his brother's untimely death, Jack had stepped in as a father figure, helping Ryan navigate the challenges of adulthood. To Jack, Ryan wasn't just family, he was like a son. But lately, something had shifted. Emily had grown distant, her laughter quieter, her touch colder. Jack noticed the change, but he chalked it up to stress. She'd mentioned feeling overwhelmed at work, and he had no reason to doubt her. Still, a gnawing sense of unease lingered, an instinct Jack tried to ignore, until the night everything unraveled. It started with a misplaced phone. Emily had left her phone on the kitchen counter, and when a notification buzzed, Jack glanced at the screen without thinking. The message read, "I can't stop thinking about last night. I miss you already." His heart skipped. He froze, staring at the words as panic gripped his chest. Emily returned to the room, and he quickly set the phone down, acting casual. She smiled, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. Jack couldn't sleep that night. He lay awake, replaying every interaction he'd seen between Emily and Ryan. At first, the idea seemed ridiculous, impossible even. Ryan was family. Emily wouldn't betray him like that. But the more he thought about it, the clearer the picture became. The next morning, Jack decided to look deeper. Emily had left for work, and Ryan was out, so Jack searched the house for answers. It didn't take long to find them. Hidden in the back of Emily's closet was a small box with a gold bracelet inside. Jack recognized it instantly. It was the same bracelet he had seen Ryan wearing in a photo on social media just weeks ago. His stomach turned. Pieces of a puzzle began falling into place, forming an image too painful to face. Memories of stolen glances, hushed conversations, and lingering touches surfaced, no longer innocent but suspicious. When Emily returned home that evening, Jack tried to act normal, but his hands trembled as he poured himself a drink. She kissed his cheek, and for the first time, he recoiled. She noticed. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft, yet distant. Jack forced a smile. "Yeah, just a long day." But the lie tasted bitter. He watched her as she moved through the house, pretending not to notice the weight of his gaze. He didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, he let the pain fester, feeding the rage building inside him. Over the next few days, Jack became consumed by suspicion. He started observing Ryan more closely too. Every time they spoke, Jack searched for cracks, anything that would confirm what he feared. Ryan's behavior didn't help. He was nervous, avoiding eye contact and fidgeting when Jack asked harmless questions. The breaking point came when Jack saw them together. He had come home early, unannounced, and found Emily and Ryan in the living room, sitting too close. Their laughter stopped the second they noticed him, and the tension that followed was undeniable. Jack said nothing. Instead, he retreated upstairs and stared at himself in the mirror. He didn't recognize the man looking back, the anger, the betrayal, the humiliation. It boiled inside him, and for the first time in his life, Jack felt capable of doing something he never thought possible. He clenched his fists and whispered to his reflection, "You'll pay for this." Jack sat in his car, parked at the edge of a deserted overlook, staring blankly at the horizon as the sun dipped below the trees. The sky burned orange, but Jack felt nothing, no warmth, no beauty, just emptiness. The words he'd seen on Emily's phone and the image of her sitting so close to Ryan replayed in his mind like a broken record. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his breath shallow and uneven. How could she? How could they? The betrayal wasn't just personal, it felt like an attack on everything he had worked to build, a life that now seemed like a lie. The thought of confronting them had crossed his mind more than once, but each time, he hesitated. not because he doubted what he'd seen, but because he wasn't ready to hear their excuses. He didn't trust himself to stay in control. Instead, he called David. "Jack? You okay, man?" David's voice was steady, grounding, exactly what Jack needed. "I need to talk," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. They met at a quiet bar, tucked away from the bustle of the town. Jack hadn't even taken his seat before the words spilled out. He told David everything, the messages, the bracelet, the way Ryan and Emily had acted when he caught them together. David listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger as the story unfolded. "That's messed up," David finally said, slamming his glass down on the table. "I mean, Ryan, your own nephew? That's beyond betrayal." Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. "I can't stop picturing it. The lies, the sneaking around. And the worst part? I trusted them both. I let Ryan into my home. I raised him after his dad died." David leaned forward. "What are you going to do?" Jack exhaled sharply. "I don't know. Part of me wants to confront them right now, tear them apart. But another part," he hesitated, ashamed of the thoughts swirling in his head. "Another part of me wants to make them pay, to make them feel as broken as I do." David's eyes darkened. "Be careful, Jack. Anger like that, it's dangerous. You can't let it consume you." But it already was. The days that followed blurred together. Jack barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were filled with images of betrayal and revenge. Emily's laughter echoed in his head, and Ryan's voice haunted him like a ghost. He started keeping his distance, avoiding Emily whenever possible. She noticed, of course. "Jack, we need to talk," she said one evening as he poured himself another drink. "Not now," he replied coldly, turning his back to her. She reached for his arm, but he pulled away. "What's going on with you?" His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, he saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the one he thought he could trust forever. But the image shattered just as quickly, replaced by the memory of her betrayal. "You tell me, Emily," he said, his voice sharp and unrecognizable. "What's going on with you?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving Jack alone with his anger. He didn't follow her. He couldn't. That night, Jack stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He replayed every interaction, every clue he had ignored, and every chance he had to stop this before it began. But what haunted him most wasn't what they had done, it was what he was becoming. The bitterness, the rage, it was growing, feeding off his pain. He didn't recognize himself anymore, and that terrified him. But a part of him didn't care. A part of him wanted to embrace it. Wanted to let it burn. Jack woke up early the next morning, the house eerily quiet. Emily was still asleep, and for a brief moment, he envied her peace, her ability to close her eyes and pretend nothing was wrong. But Jack couldn't pretend. Not anymore. Instead, he moved through the house like a shadow, observing every detail with a sharp eye. He noticed the slight changes, the way Emily kept her phone closer than usual, the way she avoided his gaze. And Ryan? He hadn't stopped by in days, which only confirmed what Jack already knew. But Jack wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. He decided to wait, to gather more evidence and give them just enough rope to hang themselves. In the meantime, he would play the role of the devoted husband, the man who trusted his wife and loved his nephew. The act wasn't easy. Emily tried to close the distance between them. She asked about his day, cooked his favorite meals, and even suggested they take a trip together. But Jack saw through it all. It wasn't love, it was guilt. And Ryan? Jack finally saw him at a family gathering later that week. The moment Ryan walked through the door, Jack's stomach tightened. He forced himself to smile, to shake Ryan's hand as if nothing had changed, but the tension in the room was palpable. "Uncle Jack," Ryan said, his voice unusually careful. "Good to see you." Jack held his gaze. "You too, Ryan." It's been a while. Emily stood nearby, her eyes darting nervously between them. Jack noticed the way Ryan avoided looking directly at her, and it confirmed what he suspected: they were afraid. Good. They should be. Throughout the evening, Jack watched them closely, searching for cracks in their performance. And sure enough, he found them. A lingering glance here. A shared moment of silence there. It was subtle, but it was enough. By the time the guests left, Jack's mind was racing. He poured himself a drink and sat in the living room, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. Emily sat down beside him. "You've been quiet all night," she said softly. Jack turned to her, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. The rejection stung, he could see it in her eyes, but Jack didn't care. "I think we should talk," she said after a long pause. Jack's heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady. "About what?" Emily hesitated. "About us. About what's been happening lately." Jack's grip tightened around his glass. This was it. She was about to confess. But then she looked away, her shoulders slumping. "I feel like you've been distant," she said. "Like something's changed between us. And I don't know why." Jack almost laughed. Was she really going to play the victim? Pretend she didn't know exactly what was wrong? But instead of calling her out, Jack leaned back inside. "I've been under a lot of stress. Work's been tough." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, Jack saw something he hadn't expected: genuine concern. But it only made him angrier. How could she look at him that way after everything she'd done? Later that night, Jack stood by the window, staring out at the empty street. He knew he couldn't keep up the act forever. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. The question was, how? Would he confront them head-on? Or would he make them suffer, the way they had made him suffer? A part of him wanted to hurt them both, to tear their lives apart and leave them broken. But another part, the part that still remembered what it felt like to love them, wasn't so sure. And that scared him more than anything. The next morning, Jack started to put his plan into motion. He invited Ryan over for dinner, pretending he wanted to catch up. Emily hesitated when she heard, but Jack reassured her. "It's been too long," he said. "I miss having him around." Emily's smile was forced, but she didn't argue. When Ryan arrived, Jack welcomed him like nothing was wrong. They ate, drank, and laughed, at least on the surface. But underneath it all, the tension simmered. Halfway through the meal, Jack leaned back in his chair and studied Ryan closely. "So, Ryan," he said casually, "how's your love life these days?" Ryan froze, his fork hovering in midair. Emily's eyes widened, and Jack felt a flicker of satisfaction. It's complicated," Ryan finally said, forcing a laugh. Jack smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Isn't it always?" The conversation moved on, but the damage was done. Ryan avoided eye contact for the rest of the night, and Emily barely spoke. When the evening ended, Jack stood by the door as Ryan left. "We should do this again soon," Jack said, his voice calm but sharp. Ryan nodded, but there was fear in his eyes. Jack closed the door and turned to Emily, who was staring at him. "What was that about?" she demanded. Jack shrugged. "Just making conversation." She didn't believe him. He could see it in her face. But before she could press further, Jack walked away, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. And for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was in control. Jack stood in his dimly lit study, staring at the framed photos lining the shelves. Pictures of him and Emily on their wedding day, smiling as if nothing could ever break them. A photo of Ryan as a teenager, beaming proudly next to Jack after catching his first fish. He clenched his jaw and turned away. Those moments felt like a cruel joke now. Jack poured himself a drink and sat at his desk. The plan was already taking shape in his mind, a perfect storm designed to expose them. But even as he mapped it out, a part of him hesitated. Was he really ready to cross that line? his thoughts were interrupted by Emily's voice. "Jack?" She stood in the doorway, her expression uncertain. "Are you coming to bed?" "Not yet," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "I need to finish something." She lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say more, but then nodded and walked away. Jack waited until he heard the bedroom door close before reaching for his phone. He texted Ryan. "Jack, hey, let's do another dinner. Saturday night. Emily and I want to talk to you." The reply came quickly. "Ryan, sure. Everything okay?" Jack, "Yeah, just catching up." But that was a lie. Saturday night wasn't going to be about catching up, it was going to be about tearing their world apart. The next few days felt like an eternity. Jack kept up the act, pretending to be the loving husband, but every touch from Emily felt like poison. He avoided her as much as possible, spending long hours in his study under the pretense of work. He rehearsed the confrontation over and over in his mind, imagining every reaction they might have. He prepared for anger, denial, even tears. Nothing would stop him this time. Finally, Saturday arrived. Jack prepared everything meticulously, the table set, the wine poured, the atmosphere deceptively warm. Emily helped, unaware of the storm about to hit. Ryan arrived right on time, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the same nervous smile Jack had come to hate. "Uncle Jack," Ryan said, stepping inside. "Emily." Emily greeted him, but Jack noticed the stiffness in her voice. She was on edge. "Good." They sat down for dinner, and at first, the conversation was light, safe topics about work, hobbies, and weekend plans. But Jack couldn't keep up the charade for long. "So, Ryan," Jack said suddenly, setting his glass down with a deliberate thud. "What's been keeping you so busy lately?" Ryan blinked, caught off guard. Just work mostly. You know, trying to stay out of trouble." Jack's smile was cold. "Trouble? That's funny. I'd say you've been finding plenty of that lately." The room fell silent. Emily's fork clattered against her plate, and Ryan froze. "Jack," Emily started, her voice trembling. "No," Jack snapped, cutting her off. "You don't get to speak right now." He turned back to Ryan. "You think I didn't notice? The looks. The secrecy. The messages on her phone." Ryan's face went pale. "Uncle Jack, it's not what you think." "Not what I think." Jack's voice rose. "Then why don't you explain it to me?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you betrayed me. Both of you." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Jack, please, let me explain." "Oh, I'd love to hear this." Jack crossed his arms and leaned back, daring her to continue. She took a shaky breath. "It's not what you think. Ryan, he threatened me." Jack's brow furrowed. "What?" "He said he'd tell you I was cheating if I didn't go along with it," Emily said, her voice breaking. "He manipulated me, Jack. I didn't know what to do." Jack's mind reeled. This wasn't part of the script he'd prepared. He had expected lies and excuses, but not this. "Is that true?" Jack demanded, turning to Ryan. Ryan's eyes were wide, his face pale. "No. She's lying. Uncle Jack, you have to believe me, she came to me." Jack slammed his fist on the table. "Enough." The sudden outburst silenced them both. Jack's chest heaved, his pulse pounding in his ears. "You're both liars," he said through gritted teeth. "And I don't know who to believe anymore." The room was thick with tension. Emily sobbed quietly, and Ryan sat frozen, his hands trembling. Jack stood and walked toward the door. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and final. "Jack," Emily started. "Out." Ryan scrambled to his feet and left without another word. Emily lingered for a moment, but Jack wouldn't even look at her. Finally, she turned and followed Ryan out the door, leaving Jack alone in the silence. He stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty table. The confrontation hadn't gone the way he planned, and now he was left with more questions than answers. Who was telling the truth? And more importantly, did it even matter? Jack stood in the dimly lit living room, his fists clenched as he replayed the chaotic dinner in his mind. Emily's trembling voice. Ryan's desperate denial. Both stories had cracked open a new kind of pain, one that made it impossible to know what was real anymore. He poured himself another drink, hoping to drown the storm inside him, but the burning liquid did nothing to numb the ache. Instead, it fueled his frustration. He needed answers. The next morning, Jack couldn't sit still. He paced the house, his thoughts spiraling. He needed to confront one of them again, alone. Ryan. Jack drove to Ryan's apartment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't bother knocking. Instead, he banged on the door until Ryan opened it, his eyes bloodshot and full of fear. "Uncle Jack." "Cut the act," Jack snapped, pushing past him into the apartment. "We're going to talk. And this time, I'm getting the truth." Ryan closed the door and turned to face him. "I already told you the truth." Jack stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Then why do I feel like you're still hiding something?" Ryan swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. "Because I am." Jack froze. For a moment, the room felt too small, the air too thick. "Go on," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan sank onto the couch, running his hands through his hair. "It wasn't supposed to happen, okay? I never meant for it to go this far." Jack's stomach twisted. "So it's true? Everything?" "Yes," Ryan admitted. "But it wasn't about love or even attraction. It was about revenge." Jack's jaw tightened. "Revenge? For what?" Ryan looked up, his eyes burning with anger. "For my dad. For the way you let him drown in debt while you built your perfect life. He begged you for help, Jack, and you turned your back on him. You left him to fail, and then you swooped in to save me, pretending to be the hero." Jack staggered back as if he'd been punched. "That's not true." "It is true," Ryan shouted. "I saw the bills, the foreclosure notices. He needed you, and you let him suffer." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He had helped Ryan's father, hadn't he? Given him advice, offered him leads. But the truth was, he hadn't written the check. He'd been too focused on protecting his own finances. Regret settled like a weight in his chest. "So this was payback?" Jack said bitterly. "You thought sleeping with my wife would make us even?" Ryan flinched. "I didn't plan it. It just happened. And then I couldn't stop. I hated you, but I hated myself even more." Jack turned away, running his hands through his hair. He wanted to scream, to hit something, but all he could feel was exhaustion. He faced Ryan again. "And Emily? Did she know? Or did you manipulate her?" Ryan hesitated. "It wasn't manipulation. She was lonely, Jack. She felt like you didn't see her anymore. I didn't force her into anything." Jack's breath caught. Emily's words from the night before echoed in his head. "I didn't know what to do." Had she been telling the truth after all? Suddenly, the weight of everything crushed down on him, the lies, the betrayal, the anger. It was too much. "Get out," Jack said through gritted teeth. Ryan blinked. "What?" "I said get out." Jack roared, his voice shaking the walls. Ryan stood, his shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry, Uncle Jack." But Jack didn't respond. He waited until Ryan was gone before sinking onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The truth had finally come out, but it didn't feel like closure. It felt like devastation. That night, Emily came home to find Jack sitting in the dark. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she should speak. Finally, she broke the silence. "Jack?" He looked up, his eyes hollow. "Sit down." Emily obeyed, her hands trembling. "I talked to Ryan," Jack said. I know everything. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. I'm so sorry, Jack. I made a terrible mistake, and I hate myself for it. Why? Jack's voice cracked. Why did you do it? She wiped her eyes. I felt invisible. You were always working, always focused on everything except us. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I was weak. Jack's shoulders slumped. As much as he wanted to hate her, he couldn't deny that some part of him understood. I don't know if I can forgive you, he admitted. Emily nodded. I don't expect you to. But I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. I just need a chance. Jack didn't respond. Instead, he stood and walked away, leaving Emily alone in the silence. Jack stood at the edge of the lake behind his house, staring at the still water as the early morning mist hovered above it. It was the same lake where he had taught Ryan how to fish, the same place he and Emily had shared picnics and lazy summer afternoons. Now, it felt like a graveyard for memories, moments that once felt unshakable but had crumbled under the weight of betrayal. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Emily. Emily, I'm leaving for my sister's. Let me know if you want to talk. Jack exhaled sharply. She was giving him space, something he'd asked for the night before. But what he really needed was clarity, and that wasn't something space could provide. He thought about Emily's words, her apology, and the raw vulnerability in her voice. She had admitted her mistakes, but her reasons still lingered in his mind. Was he to blame? Had he truly made her feel invisible? And then there was Ryan. The confession still burned in Jack's chest, reopening wounds he didn't even know he had. Ryan had acted out of resentment, but his actions had destroyed far more than he could have imagined. Jack clenched his fists. Could he forgive either of them? Should he? Later that afternoon, Jack decided he needed answers, more than just words. He drove to the park where he knew Ryan liked to run, hoping to find him there. Sure enough, Ryan was sitting on a bench, his head hung low, shoulders slumped like the weight of the world was on them. Jack approached slowly, and Ryan looked up, startled. Uncle Jack. Don't call me that, Jack interrupted, his voice firm but quieter than Ryan expected. Ryan swallowed hard and nodded. Jack sat down beside him, the silence stretching between them until it felt unbearable. Why didn't you come to me? Jack finally asked. If you were hurting, if you felt abandoned, why didn't you say something instead of doing this? Ryan stared at the ground. Because I hated you, he admitted. I hated that you seemed so perfect while my dad lost everything. And the worst part? I hated that I still needed you after he was gone. Jack's jaw tightened. So you thought this was payback? Ryan looked up, his eyes red. At first, yeah. But then I hated myself for it, and I didn't know how to stop. Jack ran his hands over his face, exhausted. I don't know what to do with this, Ryan. I don't know how to move forward. I don't either, Ryan whispered. But I'm sorry, Jack. For everything. I mean it. The apology hung in the air, fragile but genuine. Jack didn't respond, and after a long pause, he stood. Stay away from me, Jack said. And stay away from Emily. Ryan nodded slowly, tears welling up in his eyes as Jack walked away. That night, Jack sat alone in the house, the silence pressing in around him. Emily had sent another message, but he hadn't responded. He wasn't ready to face her yet. Instead, he thought about the man he had been before this, the man who had built his life on trust, loyalty, and love. And he wondered if that man was gone forever. But then he thought about the man he didn't want to become, the one consumed by bitterness and rage. He saw the damage it had already caused and knew that if he let it fester, it would destroy him completely. He picked up his phone and called Emily. She answered on the first ring. Jack? I need to see you, he said. When Emily arrived, Jack didn't speak right away. He let her sit across from him, her eyes searching as for answers he didn't yet have. I talked to Ryan, he finally said. Emily nodded, tears already forming. And I don't think I can ever look at him the same way again." She wiped her eyes. "What about me?" Jack exhaled slowly. "I don't know, Emily. Part of me wants to forgive you, but part of me feels like I'd be a fool to try." "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice breaking. "Counseling, time apart, whatever you need. I just want to fix this." Jack leaned back, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He wanted to believe her, but trust wasn't something he could rebuild overnight. "I need time," he said. "But if we do this, if we try, you need to know that it's going to be hard. I won't just forget what happened." Emily nodded. "I don't expect you to." She reached for his hand, and this time, Jack didn't pull away. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. As Emily left that night, Jack sat alone again. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it had softened, just enough for him to see the possibility of healing. He thought about Ryan and the brokenness they both carried. He thought about Emily and the cracks in their marriage that had gone unnoticed for too long. And for the first time in weeks, Jack let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't too far gone to put the pieces back together. Jack sat on the back porch, the cool night air brushing against his face as he stared at the dark horizon. The house behind him felt emptier than ever, even with Emily inside. She had come back earlier that day, carrying hope in her eyes and promises on her lips. But promises weren't enough, not yet. He sipped his coffee, letting the warmth soothe his nerves. Despite everything, part of him wanted to believe Emily's words, to believe that the broken pieces of their marriage could somehow be put back together. But forgiveness was complicated. The betrayal had carved deep wounds, and even though Emily had owned her mistakes, Jack wasn't sure he could let go of the images that haunted him: Ryan's guilt, Emily's shame, and his own failure to see it coming. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her eyes uncertain. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. Jack nodded, and she stepped outside, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "I know it's going to take time. I want you to know that I'm not giving up on us." Jack looked at her, studying her face, the exhaustion, the regret, and the vulnerability. It was the same face he had fallen in love with all those years ago. "I don't want to give up either," he said quietly. "But I can't promise it'll ever be the same." Emily nodded, her voice trembling. "I'll take whatever chance you're willing to give me." Jack reached for her hand, and this time, he didn't let go. Over the next few weeks, Jack and Emily began the slow process of rebuilding. They attended counseling sessions, had hard conversations, and faced their fears head-on. But the scars were still there. One afternoon, Jack found a letter in the mail. His name was scrawled on the envelope in handwriting he recognized immediately: Ryan's. He hesitated before opening it, his hands trembling. "Dear Jack, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it anyway. I'm sorry for everything. I let anger and resentment destroy something I should have valued more than anything: our family. You didn't deserve what I did, and neither did Emily. I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I'm leaving town. I need to get away and figure out who I am without all this anger weighing me down. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope someday you'll find peace. Thank you for being there for me when no one else was. I wish I'd appreciated it more. Ryan." Jack set the letter down, his chest tight. He didn't know if Ryan's departure gave him relief or sadness, maybe both. Later that night, he showed the letter to Emily. She read it in silence, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I hate what he did," she said softly. "But I hope he finds what he's looking for." Jack nodded. "Me too." Months passed, and little by little, the cracks in Jack and Emily's marriage began to mend. The laughter returned, first in small doses and then more freely. The trust was slower to rebuild, but each day brought a little more hope. One evening, as they sat on the same porch where so many painful conversations had taken place, Emily turned to Jack. "Do you ever think about him? Jack didn't need to ask who she meant. "Yeah," he admitted. "I do." "Do you hate him?" Jack shook his head. "No. Not anymore." Emily exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath. "Me neither." They sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt something he hadn't expected: peace.